Leah Monroe heard the front door slam while she was still kneeling beside Thomas' cross chair, wiping tears from her face. The sound came hard enough to shake the framed photographs on the entryway wall. A second later, Julian Cross appeared in the living room. His tie hung loose around his neck. His coat was folded over one arm, his leather briefcase still in his hand. He had left a board meeting downtown almost 2 hours earlier than planned, something Leah knew because Julian Cross did not come home early. Not on weekdays. Not when investors were in town. Not when half his executive team had flown in from 3 states. His eyes went immediately to his father. Thomas was sitting upright in the high-backed chair near the window. He was pale, but he was breathing normally. One hand rested on Leah's shoulder. The other was curled around the arm of the chair. Julian dropped his briefcase. What happened? Leah stood so quickly, her knee struck the coffee table. He's okay. Then why are you crying? Julian was already reaching for his phone, probably to call the nurse, the doctor, an ambulance, or all 3. Thomas made a sound. Not quite a word. Julian froze. 4 months earlier, a stroke had damaged the part of Thomas's brain that helped him use language. He still knew his son. He recognized his home. He laughed at the same old jokes and became irritated by the same bad coffee. But words that had once arrived without effort now seemed to hide from him. Some days he could say a full phrase. Other days he fought for the name of a spoon. And sometimes the more desperately he wanted to speak, the less language would cooperate. Leah pointed to the small orange card on the table. Wait. It was one of 6 communication cards his speech therapist had made. Wait. Yes. No date. Again. Tired. Help. Oh. Julian stared at the card, and then at Leah. What happened? Leah swallowed. Your father said a whole sentence. Something softened in Julian's face. What sentence? Leah looked at Thomas. That's why I'm crying. Thomas tightened his grip on the chair. His jaw worked. Leah saw the effort building through his shoulders. Take your time, she said. Julian opened his mouth. Leah lifted one finger toward him. Wait. Whoa. Thomas breathed in. Don't. He stopped. His eyes closed. Julian leaned forward. Thomas tried again. Don't let him. His voice trembled with frustration. Leah did not finish the sentence for him. Neither did Julian. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the slow ticking of the clock Thomas's wife had bought 32 years earlier. Then Thomas looked directly at Leah. Send me away. Another pause. Tomorrow. Leah's eyes filled again. It was the longest spontaneous sentence she had heard him speak since she began working in the Cross home. For one heartbeat, Julian looked almost happy. Then he understood what his father had said. His face changed. No. Thomas's fingers tightened around the chair. Julian picked up his briefcase. The move is still happening. Thomas slapped the orange card with his palm. Wait. Julian stopped. Tomorrow morning at 9, a car from Brookhaven Recovery Residence was scheduled to take Thomas to a private rehabilitation community 40 minutes outside the city. Julian called it a temporary transition. Thomas called it leaving. For the last 2 weeks, every conversation about Brookhaven had ended the same way. Julian talked faster. Thomas became more frustrated. Thomas's speech worsened under pressure. Julian interpreted the broken speech as confusion. Thomas became angrier. Julian became more convinced the move was necessary. Leah had watched the circle tighten day by day. Now, she stood between them. Dad, Julian said, you had a stroke in this house alone. Thomas looked away. You were on the kitchen floor for hours. Thomas's eyes hardened. You couldn't call anyone? Leah said quietly. Julian. No, We are not pretending this is about whether I respect him. Thomas pointed toward Julian, then toward himself, then toward the front door. Ask, Thomas said. Julian frowned. What? Ask. Leah understood. He wants you to ask him what he wants instead of telling him what's happening. I know what he wants. Thomas struck the chair arm. Leah looked at Julian. That's the problem. For the first time since Leah had started working there, Julian looked at her, not as the woman responsible for his father's meals, medications, exercises, and appointments. He looked at her as opposition. 10 minutes later, Thomas was resting in the living room, while Julian stood at the kitchen island, with both hands braced against the stone countertop. Give me an objective account. Leah remained standing. Of what? Of the conversation before I came in. We were doing speech exercises. Was Brookhaven part of the exercise? No. Did you ask Dad whether he wanted to go? Not today. Julian looked toward the living room. So that sentence just happened. Yes. You didn't practice it. No. You didn't suggest it. No. Did you tell him you thought he should stay? Leah hesitated. I told him I thought he deserved to be involved in the decision. That wasn't my question. No, I did not tell him he should stay. Julian lowered his voice. Leah, I'm not trying to punish my father. I know. And she did. That was what made the situation difficult. Julian was not an uncaring son who had become bored with an inconvenient parent. After the stroke, he had transformed the house. Grab bars appeared in both bathrooms. Loose rugs disappeared. Motion lights were installed in the hallway. A second railing went up on the stairs. He hired daytime care, and for the first 6 weeks, overnight care too. He rearranged his own work schedule, moved his home office downstairs, and canceled 2 international trips. Every prescription refill was in his calendar. Every therapy appointment was backed up in 2 places. Every doctor's number was saved in his phone. Fear had made Julian attentive. Then fear had made him controlling. Brookhaven has speech therapy on site, Julian said. Physical therapy, nursing, emergency response, someone there 24 hours a day. I know. This house isn't a rehabilitation center. No, gosh. I travel. Yes. I run a company with 1,400 employees. I know what you do. Then you know I cannot sit here every day wondering whether he's fallen. Leah looked toward the doorway. Thomas had entered quietly with his cane. He was holding the orange card. Wait. Julian's expression shifted. Dad, you shouldn't walk in here without. Thomas lifted the card higher. Julian stopped. Leah pulled out a chair for Thomas, but did not touch him. He sat. Thomas pointed at himself, then the packed suitcase near the hallway. Ask. Julian rubbed one hand over his face. Okay. He sat opposite his father. Do you want to go to Brookhaven tomorrow? Thomas shook his head. Julian nodded once. Do you understand why I want you to go? Thomas stared at him, then nodded. Do you think you can live here alone? Thomas immediately shook his head. Julian blinked. That answer had surprised him. Thomas raised one finger. 1, he said. Leah leaned closer. 1 what? Thomas pointed at the calendar. 1. His frustration rose. Leah waited. Day, Peggy. 1 day. Thomas nodded. Julian leaned back. You want 1 more day before the move. Thomas looked at Leah, then at Julian. He pointed toward the kitchen, the stairs, his medication organizer, and finally Leah. Leah understood. He wants a day to show you what staying here with proper help could actually look like. Julian stared at his father. The car comes tomorrow at 9. Thomas tapped the table once. Leah said, Then you have until 9. Julian's eyes went to her. You're making promises I have to keep. No, I'm asking you to let your father make his case. I already toured Brookhaven twice. Did he? Julian said nothing. Thomas looked down. Leah felt the weight of what she had just done. She needed this job. Her daughter, Maya, was in her second year at community college, taking nursing prerequisites while working weekends at a grocery store. A tuition installment was due in 16 days. Leah's car needed new brakes. Her apartment rent had gone up in June. This private assignment paid enough to keep all three problems from becoming emergencies at once. She could have stayed quiet. She could have prepared Thomas for the move, accepted Brookhaven's transition arrangement, and protected her income. Instead, she had given Julian a deadline in his own house. Thomas reached across the table. His hand closed around hers. The next morning, Leah arrived at 7. Thomas was already dressed. Not well. His sweater was buttoned incorrectly, and one sock was inside out. But he had dressed himself. Leah fixed nothing. "Breakfast first," she said. Thomas shook his head and pointed toward the bathroom. "You want to shower before breakfast?" "Nah, die. They was." The shower was one of Julian's biggest arguments for Brookhaven. Thomas needed supervision. Not always physical help, but someone close enough to intervene if he became unsteady. Leah set his clean clothes within reach, checked that the shower bench was stable, and remained nearby while Thomas handled the rest himself. It took him 42 minutes. Before the stroke, Thomas would have been irritated by anything that took 42 minutes. Now he emerged looking as proud as if he had finished a marathon. Leah handed him a towel. "You understand something, right?" He raised an eyebrow. "If you're trying to prove you never need help, this experiment is already over." Thomas frowned. "You do need help." His jaw tightened. "That isn't the same as being helpless." He looked away. Leah waited. Thomas finally nodded. In the kitchen, he prepared oatmeal in the microwave. Leah stood 3 feet away. He measured poorly, added too much water, corrected it, and muttered a word Leah suspected she was not supposed to repeat. She smiled. Thomas caught her. "What?" "Nothing." He pointed his spoon at her. Leah laughed. "That sounded suspiciously like your pre-stroke vocabulary." Thomas grinned. At 9:30, Julian came downstairs wearing a navy suit. He had a conference call in 20 minutes. Thomas pushed his oatmeal bowl aside. Julian looked at the bowl. "You made that?" Thomas nodded. "With Leah helping?" Thomas looked insulted. Leah said, with Leah standing nearby and being told not to interfere. Julian almost smiled. Then his phone buzzed. The smile disappeared. "I'll be in the office." Thomas pointed to the orange card. "Wait, die." Julian looked at it, then at his phone, then back at Thomas. "I have a call." Thomas pointed toward the chair. Leah understood the question before Julian did. "You asked for 1 day," she said. "He wants you here for it. I cannot cancel everything." Thomas's face tightened. Julian sighed. "I can give you 30 minutes." Thomas held up one finger. 1 hour. Julian asked. "Nod." Julian stared at his phone. Then he typed something. 45. Thomas thought about it. Nod. It was a negotiation. Small, imperfect, but real. At 11, Denise Park arrived for Thomas's regularly scheduled speech-language therapy session. Denise was in her 50s, calm without being sweet, and one of the few people who could tell Thomas he was wrong without making him feel small. She carried a canvas bag full of notebooks, picture cards, dry erase boards, and objects Thomas sometimes called kindergarten torture. Today, Julian stayed in the room. Denise looked surprised. "Special occasion. My father is making an argument." Thomas pointed at Julian. "He's judging the argument?" Leah added. Denise sat. "Then let's make sure everybody understands the rules." Julian frowned. What rules? Mr. Cross may use speech, pointing, writing, gesture, or choices. Difficulty producing a word does not automatically tell us whether he understands the question, and you give him time. Thomas smiled at Denise. Julian caught it. All right. Denise placed several cards on the table. She began with simple orientation questions. Where are you? Thomas pointed to home. Who is this? He pointed to Julian. What happened to you? He struggled for the word. State. Denise waited. Stroke baritone. What month is it? Thomas chose the wrong card. Julian shifted in his seat. Denise asked the season. Thomas pointed to spring correctly. She asked the year. Correct. Dot. Then she tried the month again. Thomas chose April instead of May. Julian looked at Leah. Leah did not react. Denise moved on. Do you know what is planned for tomorrow? Thomas pointed to facility. Do you want to go tomorrow? No, Darshad. Do you believe you are safe living alone? Thomas looked annoyed. Then chose no. Julian's shoulders loosened slightly. Do you think you need help during the day? Yes. We. During the night. Thomas hesitated. He looked toward Julian. Leah noticed. Answer for you, she said. Thomas looked back at the cards. After several seconds, he chose yes. His face tightened. That answer cost him. Julian saw it. Denise placed 3 new cards on the table. Home with help. Brookhaven. .2. Unsure. What do you want right now? Thomas touched home with help. Denise nodded. What if adequate help cannot be arranged? Thomas froze. For almost a minute, he did nothing. Then, he touched unsure. Julian leaned forward. That matters. Thomas glared at him. Denise held up her hand. Wait. Julian sat back. Thomas reached for the dry erase marker. His hand was less coordinated since the stroke. Writing exhausted him. Slowly, he printed. Try home. Then, underneath it. Not alone. Leah felt something shift in the room. Thomas was not denying reality. He knew he could not safely return to his old life. He was asking for a different version of the new one. After Denise left, Julian followed Leah into the laundry room. For several minutes he watched her fold towels. Finally, he said, he called me twice. Leah looked up. The day of the stroke. Julian stared at the washing machine. I was in a financing meeting. We had people from Boston in the room, lawyers, bankers. Everyone had been working on the deal for 8 months. Leah set down a towel. My phone vibrated. His voice changed. I saw Dad's name. He swallowed. I turned the phone face down. Leah said nothing. I told myself I'd call him in an hour. How long was it? Almost 4. Julian pressed his lips together. When I called, he didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. I sent my assistant here because she was closer than I was. Leah already knew Thomas had been found on the kitchen floor. She had not known the rest. How long had he been down? 11 hours, according to the doctor's best estimate. The number made Leah close her eyes. Julian laughed once, without humor. So yes, I installed lights. Yes, I track his medication. Yes, I want 24-hour supervision. That makes sense. He looked at her sharply. You've spent 2 weeks acting like I'm imprisoning him. No, I've spent 2 weeks saying you're scared. I have a reason. Yes. Julian waited. Leah folded another towel. You still can't make the next bad thing impossible. I can reduce the chance. You can. Then why are you fighting me? I'm not fighting safety. What are you fighting? The idea that safety means his answer stops mattering. Julian paced once across the room. You know what Brookhaven offered? No? They offered to keep you as his transition caregiver for 6 weeks. Leah stopped. Same rate. They said it would help him adjust. You arranged that? Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I planned to today. She understood what he was offering. Continuity for Thomas. Income for her. Control for Julian. It was not a threat. That almost made it harder. You could go with him, Julian said. He trusts you. If he chooses Brookhaven, I'll help him pack. He isn't going to choose it. Maybe not tomorrow. So what do you want me to do? It was the first time Julian had asked instead of argued. Leah leaned against the counter. 30 days. His eyebrows rose. A home trial with actual conditions. Not Thomas pretending he's independent. Not you checking on him every 11 minutes. That's oddly specific. You checked the hallway camera 11 times yesterday afternoon. Julian looked offended. Then, embarrassed. There are no cameras in private areas. I know. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm saying everybody in this house is behaving as if fear is a full-time job. He almost smiled. Almost. 30 days, Leah repeated. Day, coverage, overnight coverage, therapy, safety rules, backup plan, then reassess. I'll refuse half of that. Then he doesn't get the trial. Julian stared at her. You'd tell him no. If he wants to stay home without enough support, yes. For the first time that day, Julian looked less alone. They presented the idea to Thomas after lunch. Leah divided a legal pad into 2 columns. Must. Maybe. Daytime caregiver, she said. Thomas pointed to must. Overnight caregiver. He shook his head. Julian started speaking. Leah tapped the orange card. Wait, White. Thomas frowned at her. You said you know you can't be alone. He pointed at the bed. Night. Yes, people usually sleep at night. Thomas rolled his eyes. Julian covered a smile. Leah continued. What happens if you wake up dizzy or fall going to the bathroom? Thomas's expression changed. He disliked the answer. That did not make it less true. Slowly, he pointed to must. Julian wrote it down. No driving, Julian said. Thomas stared at him. No? It was the clearest word he had said all afternoon. Julian folded his arms. You drove through the garage door 3 years before the stroke. Thomas pointed angrily at him. That was ice. Leah blinked. 4 words. Julian looked equally surprised. Then he laughed. You hit the garage from inside. Thomas paused. Leah turned away so he would not see her smiling. Finally, Thomas pointed to must. No basement stairs without someone with you, Leah said. Must. Medication, organizer. Must. Medical alert button. Thomas grimaced. Julian lifted it from the counter. It weighs less than your watch. Thomas pointed at the watch, as if that proved his case. Leah waited. Must. Therapy appointments continue. Thomas pointed to must before she finished. Julian added another condition. If you fall again, we immediately reconsider Brookhaven. Thomas pushed the legal pad away. No. There. Thomas pointed at the suitcase. You think if you fall once, Julian is going to use it as proof you have to leave, Leah said. Thomas nodded. Julian's frustration returned. I'm not waiting for him to fail. Thomas looked directly at him. Leah said, then worded differently. Julian thought. If there is another fall or major safety problem, we meet with the care team and discuss whether the home plan is still working. Thomas stared at the paper. Leah asked, fair? He did not answer. Mr. Cross. His eyes went to her. If you're asking everybody else to listen to your choices, you have to listen when they tell you something you don't like. Thomas looked betrayed. Leah waited. Finally, He pointed to must. The list was not freedom. It was compromise. That evening, Leah found Thomas alone at the dining table. In front of him was a page from his therapy notebook. He had written it weeks earlier. The handwriting sloped badly. 3 words were scratched out. One sentence required Leah to study it before she understood. If I can't be safe here, I will go. Beneath it, I want to be asked before I am moved. Leah read the lines twice. She sat across from him. You wrote this? Nada. You never showed Julian. Thomas looked down. Why? He shrugged. That's not an answer. He pointed at his mouth. You couldn't explain it? He shook his head. Then pointed toward Julian's office. You thought he wouldn't listen? Nod. Leah looked at the page again. Something important had changed. All day she had believed Thomas's goal was staying in the house. But that was not quite true. His deepest fear was not Brookhaven. It was losing the ability to participate in his own life. The house had become the battlefield because it was the first major decision after the stroke. If Julian could move him without his agreement, what came next? His money? His clothes? His routines? His friends? His coffee? What time he went to bed? Whether he was allowed to prune June's roses? Thomas pointed at the paper. Leah nodded. I understand. He relaxed. But you're doing something Julian does. Thomas frowned. You decided what he would do before you gave him a chance to answer. His mouth tightened. You didn't show him because you assumed he wouldn't listen. Thomas pointed toward himself as if to say, obviously. Leah shook her head. You don't get to demand that he ask you while you refuse to tell him the whole truth. Thomas looked angry. Good. Anger was sometimes what remained when pride had nowhere else to go. If you're willing to consider Brookhaven later if home becomes unsafe, Julian needs to know. Thomas turned his head away. Leah stayed. After almost a minute, he picked up the orange card. Wait, I'm trying. Leah waited. Scared. Her expression softened. Off Brookhaven. Thomas shook his head. Off another stroke? No. Off falling? No, bite, cut. Thomas touched his mouth. Then his temple. Leah understood. You're afraid you won't be able to tell people what you want? His eyes filled. Yes. Leah reached across the table but stopped before touching his hand. Thomas closed the distance himself. When Julian came downstairs, Leah handed him the page. He read it. Then read it again. Dad wrote this. Thomas nodded. When? Thomas struggled. Julian immediately said, Was it after the hospital? Leah interrupted. One question. Julian stopped. He tried again. Did you write this here? Thomas nodded. Before Leah started. A pause. No. After. Yes. Julian looked at Leah. She said, Keep going. Do you mean what you wrote? Thomas nodded. If staying here becomes unsafe, you'll consider leaving. Nod. But you want to be asked. Thomas slapped the paper with one finger. Yes. Julian lowered himself into the chair across from him. I thought you were saying no to everything because you didn't understand. Thomas's jaw hardened. I know. Torture D. Thomas pointed at him. Then his mouth. Fast. I talk too fast. Nod. Dod. Thomas pointed at himself. Slow. Julian's eyes dropped. You're slow. Thomas looked offended. Leah said, Careful. Julian almost laughed. I mean the words are slow. Thomas nodded. And I keep treating slow like it means no answer. Thomas stared at him. Then nodded once. Julian looked down at the paper. For the first time, Leah saw shame on his face instead of fear. The progress lasted less than 3 hours. At 6, Julian found Thomas's communication notebook on the side table. Most pages contained Thomas's own writing exercises. A few contained sentences Leah had written in large block letters so he could point to them when speech failed. I need a break. I want to call Julian. I do not understand. Please ask one question. I want to stay home. Julian held up the notebook. What is this? Communication support. You wrote these. Some. You wrote, I want to stay home. Because he chose it. How? I offered several phrases. He selected that one. Julian flipped another page. So when he points to this, how do I know I'm hearing him and not you? Leah felt her patience thin. You know, because we confirm choices. With questions, he can barely answer. Thomas entered from the hallway. He saw the notebook in Julian's hand. His face changed. He reached for it. Julian stepped backward. Dad, I'm trying to understand. Thomas reached again. His cane landed awkwardly against the rug. The rubber tip slipped. His knee buckled. Leah caught his elbow. Julian caught his other arm. For 2 seconds, Thomas's weight hung between them. Then they steadied him. The room went silent. Julian's face had gone white. There. Thomas pulled his arm away. Julian pointed at the cane. There. That is exactly what I'm talking about. He almost fell. Yes. Thomas stared at Leah. She did not soften the truth. Yes, you almost fell. Julian threw the notebook onto the table. And tomorrow I'm supposed to gamble on 30 days? He reached because you took something from him and backed away. So it's my fault? No. It means context matters. He could break a hip while we debate context. Thomas struck his cane against the floor. Julian ignored him. That was the moment Leah lost patience. Look at him. Julian stopped. What? Your father is standing 3 feet away from you, and you're arguing about him like he left the room. Julian's face hardened. That's enough. Thomas lifted the orange card. Wait. Julian did not. No, I hired you to care for him, not turn every decision into a referendum. I'm asking you to include him. You are interfering with a family decision. Then maybe your family decision should involve your family. Silence. Leah knew before Julian spoke. I'm ending assignment. Thomas made a sound. Leah's stomach dropped. Julian continued, voice controlled. I'll pay through the end of the week. I'll tell the agency there was no misconduct. Brookhaven can arrange someone else. Thomas shook his head violently. No. Julian did not look at him. Leah reached into her pocket. The house key felt suddenly heavy. She removed it from her ring and placed it on the table. Thomas's eyes filled. Leah crouched beside him. I have to go if he ends the assignment. Thomas pointed toward the key. No. You still have a voice after I leave. He looked frightened. Leah pushed the orange card toward him. Use this. Wait. Then she looked at Julian. And when he shows you that, stop. Julian said nothing. Leah picked up her bag. At the front door, Thomas called after her. Leah. She turned. It was one of the clearest words he had said all week. He raised his hand. Not goodbye. Wait. Leah waited. Thomas pressed his fist against his chest. Thank. His face twisted. Leah's throat tightened. You don't owe me a thank you. He shook his head. Thank. She waited. You. Leah smiled through tears. You're welcome. Then she left. Without Leah, Julian discovered how loud a quiet house could be. At first, he told himself the discomfort was necessary. He made tea. Thomas wanted coffee. Julian brought the gray blanket from the sofa. Thomas pushed it away. The green one? Thomas nodded. Julian brought the green blanket. At 7:30, He asked whether Thomas wanted to watch baseball. Thomas tried to answer. Nothing came. Julian waited 3 seconds. Okay, no television. Thomas slapped the chair arm. Julian turned. His father was furious. What? Thomas pointed toward the orange card. It was still on the dining table. Julian retrieved it. Wait, I sure. He sat. Okay. Thomas opened his mouth. No word came. Julian's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Thomas saw that. Julian turned it face down. I'm waiting. Thomas tried again. You? Yes. Thomas's brow tightened. Julian almost guessed. He stopped himself. You? Thomas touched his own chest. Slow. Julian nodded. The words are slow. Thomas pointed at Julian. Fast. I'm fast. Nod. Thomas pointed again. Scared. Julian stared at him. You're scared. Thomas shook his head. He pointed harder at Julian. Julian went still. You think I'm scared? Thomas nodded. Julian laughed once. There was no humor in it. Of course I'm scared. Thomas watched him. You almost died in this house. Thomas looked away. Julian leaned forward. I found out because my assistant called me crying. Thomas's eyes returned to him. I was supposed to answer the phone. Thomas frowned. Julian had never told him. I saw your name. His voice cracked. I declined the call. Thomas's face changed. Julian looked down at his hands. I keep thinking that if I had answered, maybe you wouldn't have spent 11 hours on the floor. Thomas reached toward him. Julian shook his head. No, don't make me feel better. I know what the doctor said. I know I didn't cause the stroke. Thomas kept his hand extended. Julian looked at it, then took it. Thomas squeezed once. Julian closed his eyes. I built the company by assuming every risk I can identify is my responsibility. Thomas nodded. Julian laughed quietly. You taught me that. Thomas's mouth moved. Work. Yes. Thomas pointed at Julian. Not. He stopped. Julian waited. People. Julian stared at him. Risk management works better on companies than people. Thomas nodded. Julian smiled despite himself. That's annoyingly good. Thomas opened his notebook. He searched several pages until he found a sentence. Julian comes every night. He never stays. Julian read it twice. I come home every night. Thomas stared at him. I'm here. The stare continued. Then Julian understood. You mean I'm physically here? Nod. But I'm working. Nod. Calling people. Nod. Checking things. Nod. Fixing things. Nod. Julian looked around the room. Grab bars. Medication. Charts. Schedules. Alerts. A house full of proof that he had been present. None of it proved he had stayed. His phone buzzed again. He picked it up. Thomas's expression fell. Julian pressed the power button. The screen went black. He set the phone on the floor. Okay. Thomas waited. I'm staying. Leah was halfway home on the bus when her agency supervisor called. Julian Cross contacted us. Leah looked out the window. City lights passed across the glass. I assumed he would. He said it was a family fit issue. Specifically said there was no neglect, misconduct, or performance problem. Leah closed her eyes. Even angry, Julian had kept his word. We can probably give you 2 morning shifts next week, the supervisor continued. Maybe a weekend overnight. That's fine. It was not fine. 2 morning shifts would not cover the tuition installment. Her daughter could defer a semester. Leah hated even thinking it. Maya had worked too hard. I'll take whatever you have. She hung up. 5 minutes later, her phone rang again. Julian. 2. Leah let it ring 4 times before answering. Yes? I need you to come back. No, but a long silence. I deserve that. This isn't about what you deserve. I don't know how to talk to him. Leah closed her eyes. Yes, you do. I really don't. You don't know how to wait. The bus stopped. Passengers moved down the aisle. Julian said quietly, "Come back for an hour." No job? I fired you. Yes. I'm asking you to come as, I don't know, a consultant? I'll pay you. I'm not coming back because you pay me. Another silence. What do you want? Leah thought carefully. If I come back, I'm there to help the two of you communicate, not convince him to stay, not convince him to go. Fine. And you don't repeat a question in 5 different ways because you dislike the first answer. Fine. And if you start treating me like an obstacle again, I leave. Understood. Leah pulled the stop cord. She got off the bus 3 stops later and crossed the street to catch one heading back. When she returned, Thomas was sitting at the dining table. Julian had placed the weight card directly in front of himself. Leah noticed. She did not comment. They began again. Mr. Cross, Leah said, Julian needs to understand what you're willing to accept if you stay here. Thomas nodded. You can speak, point, write, or tell us to come back later. Nod. Dot. Julian asked the first question. Overnight caregiver every night. Thomas's face tightened. Then he nodded. Daytime caregiver. No. Day. Therapy. Nod. Dot. Medical alert button. Thomas touched it with obvious disgust, then nodded. No driving? He looked at Julian for a long time. Julian did not move. Thomas finally nodded. No basement stairs alone? Nod. If there's another serious fall, will you meet with me and the care team and discuss Brookhaven again? Thomas reached for the marker. Slowly he wrote, Ask me then. Julian read it. Fair. Thomas studied him, then pointed at the words. Julian nodded. I mean it. Thomas looked at Leah. She said, That sounds like an agreement to me. Julian leaned back, then asked, Why didn't you tell me this before? Thomas's expression changed. He pointed at Julian, then raised both hands and moved them quickly. Fast, Julian said. Nod. Dot. Thomas pointed at himself. Slow. Yes. Thomas touched his mouth, then pointed at Julian. He snapped his fingers shut. Julian understood. I answered before you finish. Thomas nodded. Julian looked down. I do. Thomas waited. Julian looked up again. I'm sorry. Thomas stared at him. His face softened. Then Thomas pointed at himself. Sorry. You? Stubborn. Julian laughed. Absolutely. Thomas pointed at Julian. Same. Julian's laugh broke halfway through. Leah looked away. Some moments did not need witnesses. Eventually Julian called Brookhaven. I need to postpone tomorrow's intake. Thomas's head lifted. Julian held up one finger. One day, he told him, we finish evaluating the home plan tomorrow morning. Thomas considered, then nodded. It was not 30 days. Not yet. But it was the first major decision in the house made after Thomas finished answering. The next morning almost destroyed everything. Leah returned at 8. She was not officially Thomas's caregiver anymore. Julian had asked the agency to hold off reassigning her until noon. They were supposed to finalize the safety plan, confirm staffing, and decide whether the 30-day trial could actually work. When Leah entered the kitchen, the back door was open. Thomas was standing at the threshold, without his cane. 2 stone steps outside were wet from overnight rain. Beyond them was the small garden his late wife, June, had planted behind the house. Rose bushes bordered the fence. Thomas held pruning shears. Leah's stomach dropped. "What are you doing?" Thomas pointed outside. "No." His face hardened. "Not alone." He looked offended. "The steps are wet." Thomas pointed to the railing. "You still need the cane." He raised the shears. Leah blocked the doorway. "If this 30-day trial means proving you don't need help, we're done before breakfast." Thomas tried to move around her. Leah did not touch him. She simply remained between him and the steps. His anger rose. "Move." It was clear. "No." Thomas stared at her. "I said I would help you have choices. I did not say I'd agree with every choice." He pointed at the garden. "June." Leah's expression softened. "I know." He looked toward the rose bushes. She understood. He had spent 38 years tending that garden with his wife. June had died 2 years before the stroke. Thomas still pruned the roses the way she had taught him. "He wants to go to the garden," Julian said from behind them. Leah turned. He was standing in the hallway. He had seen everything. Thomas's shoulders dropped. Julian looked at the wet steps. Then, at the missing cane. "You agreed not to do this." Thomas shook his head. "You agreed to ask for help." Thomas looked away. Julian's face tightened. "That's it," Leah said. "Julian." "No, we spent all night building a plan, and he broke it before breakfast." Thomas struck the wall with his palm. Julian flinched. For a second, both men looked equally frightened, then equally angry that the other could see it. Julian took out his phone. "I'm calling Brookhaven." Thomas said, "No Batarsi ready to more." Julian walked away. Leah did not stop him. Thomas looked at her, betrayed. "You made this harder." He stared. "You did." Thomas pointed toward the hallway. "He did things wrong too. That doesn't erase what you did." Thomas's eyes filled. Leah softened her voice. "Wanting a voice doesn't mean you get no consequences." He looked at the garden. "June." "I know." She handed him the cane. "You could ask somebody to go with you." Thomas shook his head. "Why?" He struggled. "Mine. The garden is yours. Not Dottie. And needing someone with you makes it feel less yours." His face broke slightly. "Yes." Leah nodded. "I understand." Thomas looked hopeful. "I still won't let you go down wet steps without the cane." His expression soured. Leah almost smiled. "Ask." He looked toward the hallway. His pride fought him. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, Thomas drew a breath. "Julian." His son stopped halfway down the hall. Thomas lifted the cane. "Help." He pointed toward the garden. "Garden. Garden." Julian's face changed. He looked at Leah. Then his father. He put the phone into his pocket. "Okay." Thomas held up one finger. Julian waited. "Please." Julian swallowed. "Yeah, Dad." He stepped forward. "I'll help." The moment did not solve the argument. Julian still believed Brookhaven was safer. Thomas still wanted 30 days at home. But for 10 minutes, father and son stood together in June's garden. Thomas sat on the wooden bench while Julian clipped one dead rose stem. Thomas immediately shook his head. "What?" Thomas pointed at the branch. Julian clipped another. Thomas looked horrified. Leah laughed from the doorway. "He says you're murdering the roses." "I run a technology company, not a landscaping business." Thomas held out his hand for the shears. Julian hesitated, then placed them in his father's hand. Thomas demonstrated from the bench. Julian watched. That was how the morning might have ended. Instead, at 8:40, Brookhaven called back. They could still take Thomas at 9. Julian looked at the wet steps. Fear returned. The old pattern returned with it. I think he should go. Thomas's face closed. Leah said, then ask him. I already know the answer. Ask anyway. Julian did. Thomas said no. At 8:55, a Brookhaven transport van pulled into the driveway. The sight of it changed the air inside the house. Thomas sat in the living room. His suitcase waited beside the stairs. Julian stood near the window. Leah remained beside Thomas. A uniformed intake aide knocked. Julian opened the door. Mr. Cross. My father is here. The woman rolled in a transport chair. We'll get him settled before lunch. Thomas's fingers curled around the arms of his chair. Leah saw the fear. Not fear of the facility itself. Fear of momentum. The van had arrived. The suitcase was packed. A professional was standing at the door. Everyone had begun behaving as if the decision were already over. Leah crouched beside him. Mr. Cross. He looked at her. Do you understand where the van is taking you? Nod, dud. Do you understand Brookhaven has staff and therapy? Nod, dadu. Do you want me to help you stand and transfer into that chair? Thomas shook his head. No, dad. Julian stepped forward. Dad, you broke the safety agreement this morning. Thomas nodded. We said we would reassess if that happened. Thomas raised a finger. Julian continued. You cannot keep doing dangerous things because you miss Mom. Thomas's face crumpled. Julian saw it. His own face softened. But he continued. I love you too much to spend every day wondering whether I'm going to find you on the floor again. Thomas's eyes filled. Julian looked at Leah. Help me transfer him. Leah stood. The intake aide stepped aside. Leah's heart pounded. She knew exactly what refusing could cost. Julian had already fired her once. The agency could decide she was too involved. Brookhaven could complain. She could walk out with no job and no reference from one of the best-paying assignments she had ever had. Thomas looked at her. Leah made her choice. No. Julian stared. What? I'll help him transfer if he chooses to transfer. Leah, I will not use my hands to turn his no into a yes. Julian's face flushed. You are not his decision-maker. No. Then stop behaving like you are. I'm not deciding for him. You're blocking the safest plan. I'm refusing to pretend he hasn't answered. Julian pointed toward Thomas. He nearly walked down wet stairs without his cane 45 minutes ago. Yes. He could fall tonight. Yes. He could have another medical emergency. Yes. So what am I supposed to do? Leah looked at Thomas. Ask. Julian laughed bitterly. He said no. Then ask what he is willing to do. We already did that. Do it while the van is here. Thomas reached toward the table. His hand found the orange card. Wait. Dull. Julian stared at it. The intake aide remained silent. Julian finally took the card from his father's hand. Wait. He looked down at the word, then sat opposite him. All right. His voice was quieter. I'm waiting. Thomas breathed in. Home. Julian nodded. 30. Thomas stopped. Nobody spoke. Days. Julian waited. Help. Thomas pointed toward the upstairs bedrooms where an overnight aide could stay. Then toward the medical alert button. Then toward his cane. Use help. Julian's eyes filled. Thomas continued. Garden. He stopped. Julian almost spoke. He caught himself. Ask. Thomas nodded. Fall. Oh. His voice failed. Leah could see frustration rising. She pointed to the card. Wait, Doyle. Thomas breathed. Fall. He looked directly at Julian. Ask me. Julian leaned forward. You mean if you fall again, we talk again? Nod. About Brookhaven. Nod. Thomas swallowed. Maybe. Julian froze. Thomas touched his own chest. Maybe go. Nobody moved. It was the first time Thomas had spoken those words aloud. Maybe go. Leah understood the cost of them. He was offering Julian uncertainty. For Thomas, that was enormous. Julian's voice dropped. You're not saying never. Thomas shook his head. Julian covered his mouth. Thomas leaned forward. Don't. His voice weakened. Leah waited. Move me. He paused. Because the word would not come. His frustration rose. He pointed at Julian, then made a fist against his own chest. Julian understood before Leah did. Because I'm scared. Thomas nodded. Julian's eyes filled. The room was silent. Finally, Julian said, I am scared. Thomas's face softened. I'm terrified. He looked toward the kitchen. I still see you on that floor even though I wasn't here. Thomas reached toward him. Julian took his hand. But you were wrong this morning. Thomas nodded reluctantly. You cannot prove you're independent by doing dangerous things. Another reluctant nod. And I was wrong to treat one mistake like a verdict. Thomas squeezed his hand. Julian looked toward the transport chair. Then, at Leah. Can the home coverage actually be arranged? Yes, but not by me alone. What do we need? Day coverage, overnight coverage, backup coverage, continuing therapy, medical follow-up, and a real reassessment plan. Not you filling every gap yourself. Julian nodded. He stood, then turned to the Brookhaven aide. I'm sorry. The woman closed her folder. We're not coming today. Thomas's shoulders dropped. Not triumph. Relief. The aide nodded professionally. If circumstances change, call the admissions office. We will. Julian walked her to the door. The transport chair rolled back outside. A minute later, the van pulled away. Thomas watched it disappear. His eyes filled. Leah sat beside him. You okay? He nodded, then shook his head. Leah smiled gently. Both. Nod. Julian returned. For a few seconds, father and son looked at each other. Then Julian pointed toward the suitcase. I'm taking that upstairs. Thomas lifted one finger. Julian stopped. Thomas pointed at the suitcase. Then the closet downstairs. Julian frowned. You want it left packed? Thomas nodded. Leah understood. The suitcase was not defeat anymore. It was an acknowledgement. Home had 30 days. Not forever. If the plan failed, Thomas would reconsider. Julian carried the suitcase to the downstairs closet. He did not hide it. He did not put it beside the door. He simply closed the closet. By noon, the house was full of phone calls. Julian contacted the home care agency, then Thomas's care coordinator, then his therapy office. He tried to do what he always did, solve everything personally. Leah stopped him after the fourth call. You cannot be the backup aide every time somebody calls in sick. I can work from home. Sometimes. I can rearrange meetings. Sometimes. He frowned. You keep saying sometimes. Because that's how sustainable plans work. Thomas, sitting nearby, pointed at Leah and gave Julian a satisfied nod. Julian stared at him. Don't encourage her. Thomas smiled. The agency could provide an overnight caregiver beginning that evening. Day shifts were already covered for most of the week. They added a second backup worker. Julian requested that Leah return as Thomas's primary daytime caregiver. The supervisor said she would need to speak with Leah directly. Julian looked at her. I assume you're enjoying this. A little. He handed her the phone. Leah stepped into the hallway. The supervisor asked whether she wanted the assignment back. Leah looked through the doorway. Thomas was making Julian wait while he struggled to explain something about the garden. Julian was actually waiting. Yes, Leah said, but with conditions. When she returned, Julian pushed the house key toward her. Leah left it on the table. He looked confused. Agency first. I just talked to them. Written schedule. Overnight coverage confirmed. Backup person named. I'm not becoming the entire plan by myself. Thomas pointed at the key. Then, at Leah. Stay. I am staying. He pointed harder. Leah smiled. But I'm not going to make your independence depend on one caregiver. Thomas frowned. If I get sick, you still need a plan. Thomas looked at Julian. Julian said, she's right. Thomas rolled his eyes. Leah laughed. Get used to that phrase. At 4, the agency emailed the finalized schedule. Only then did Leah pick up the key. Thomas watched her clip it back onto her ring. His shoulders relaxed. Later, he asked to go outside. He did not simply walk toward the door. He brought his cane. Then he pointed at Leah. Garden? You asking? Nod. Yes. Julian joined them. Thomas sat on the bench while Leah checked her phone for the next medication time. Julian took the pruning shears. Thomas immediately pointed at the wrong branch. Not that one? Thomas shook his head. This one? Another shake. Dad, there are approximately 6,000 branches. Thomas laughed. Julian looked at him. The sound seemed to surprise both men. Thomas pointed carefully. Julian clipped the correct stem. Thomas nodded approval. Finally, Julian said. Thomas gave him a look. Leah sat back. She had seen wealthier houses, larger gardens, more expensive furniture. But for the first time since she entered the Cross home, it felt less like a recovery ward and more like somewhere people lived. That evening, Julian found Leah near the front door. When I came home yesterday, he stopped. Leah waited. I saw you crying beside him, and I thought something terrible had happened. You looked ready to call 3 ambulances. 4. She smiled. Julian glanced toward his father. What you said about the sentence? Leah nodded. It wasn't just that he spoke more words. No. He used them for something he cared about. Yes. Julian lowered his voice. I heard every word. Leah looked at him. But I didn't hear what they meant. She nodded. You do now. He looked toward Thomas. I'm trying. That's enough for today. What about tomorrow? Try again. The 30-day home trial was not easy. On day 3, an overnight aide called out sick. Julian immediately announced he would cancel his morning meeting and stay home. Leah stopped him. Backup person. I can cover it. You can. That doesn't mean you should every time. The backup aide arrived 40 minutes later. Julian went to work. Thomas watched him leave, then pointed toward Leah. Hard. For him. Nod. For you too. Thomas shrugged. You're impossible. He smiled. On day 6, Thomas became furious during speech therapy and threw a marker onto the floor. The word he wanted was insurance. It would not come. He tried 3 times. Then, 5-2. Julian happened to be in the room. Leah watched him begin to answer. Then stop. Thomas looked at him. Julian pointed to the orange card. Wait. Thomas breathed. In. He stopped. Julian remained silent. Insure. Another pause. Insurance. Julian smiled. There it is. Thomas stared at him, then smiled too. On day 9, Thomas woke at 2 in the morning and became dizzy walking to the bathroom. The overnight caregiver reached him before he fell. She documented the incident. Julian arrived at the house at 6. Old fear covered his face. Thomas was already sitting at the table. The suitcase remained in the closet. Julian did not drag it out. He sat down. What happened? Thomas pointed to the written report. I read it. I want your version. Thomas looked surprised. Leah, arriving behind Julian, heard the question. She said nothing. Thomas took almost 4 minutes to explain. Dizzy. Bathroom. Sat down. Cold. Help. No fall. Julian listened. When Thomas finished, Julian asked, Do you still want to stay? Nod. Dut. Do you think the overnight caregiver prevented this from becoming worse? Nod. Do. Then, the plan worked. Thomas blinked. Julian stood. We keep going. Leah waited until Julian walked into the kitchen. Then she followed. That was good. He poured coffee. I'm learning. You waited 4 minutes. I thought I aged a decade. Leah laughed. Julian looked toward his father. I spent my whole career believing speed was competence. Sometimes, he's teaching me otherwise. On day 14, Leah received a call from Maya Tai. Her tuition payment deadline had arrived. Leah stepped into the laundry room. I'm covering it, she said. You don't have to. Yes, I do. I can take the semester off. No. Mom. No? Leah looked through the doorway toward Thomas. Her income was stable again because the assignment had resumed. But the week she had lost had mattered. I have enough. That was not entirely true. She could cover tuition or the car breaks immediately. Not both. Maya knew her too well. You're doing the thing. What thing? The I'm your mother so mathematics no longer applies thing. Leah laughed despite herself. I handle it. After she hung up, she found Thomas standing in the doorway. He pointed toward the phone. Maya? Leah nodded. Thomas knew about her daughter. School. Yes. He pointed toward Leah's wallet. No. Thomas frowned. You are not giving me money. He looked offended. You already pay me through the agency. Thomas pointed toward himself. Mine. Your money is yours. Correct. He pointed toward Leah. Help. She smiled. You learned that word too well. He tapped the orange card. Wait. Dune. Then, he struggled. Help? He touched his chest. Not. Leah waited. Helpless. She stopped smiling. It was a phrase she had used with him during the first day. Needing help is not being helpless. Now, he was giving it back. Leah's eyes filled. Thomas pointed toward the phone. You're saying asking Maya to help figure it out doesn't make me helpless? Nod. Dying. Leah laughed softly. You're irritating. Thomas smiled. That night, Leah told Maya the truth. They moved the tuition payment by 1 week and split the car repair into 2 stages. Nothing magical happened. No billionaire wrote a check. No hidden account solved the problem. Leah simply accepted the same lesson she had been demanding Thomas learn. Help could be part of dignity. On day 19, Brookhaven called. A room would be available the following month if Thomas wanted it. Julian did not answer. He put the phone on speaker, then looked at his father. What do you want me to tell them? Thomas stared at the phone. For several seconds, Leah feared he might refuse even to discuss it. Then he said, Hold. Julian asked the admissions coordinator to hold the option until the home trial review. After he hung up, Thomas pointed at the phone. Good. Julian nodded. Good. Thomas relaxed. The facility was no longer a threat being done to him. It was an option, waiting for an answer. By day 28, the orange weight card had become worn at the edges. There was a coffee stain near the WA. One corner had bent. Leah offered to replace it. Thomas shook his head. Keep. Nod die. Julian found a clear plastic sleeve and slid the card inside. Thomas inspected it, then pointed at his son. CEO. Julian frowned. That's your compliment? Thomas nodded solemnly. Leah laughed. What does that mean? Julian shook his head. It means he thinks laminating something is the first useful executive skill I've demonstrated. Thomas nodded. On day 30, they held the reassessment at the same dining table where the argument had begun. Thomas. Julian. Leah. Denise. The care coordinator joined by video. There had been no falls. One dizziness incident. One missed medication dose caught within 30 minutes. Several angry arguments. No emergency room visits. Thomas still needed daytime and overnight assistance. He still could not safely drive. He still hated the alert button. And communication remained difficult. Nothing about 30 days had restored his old life. That was never the goal. Denise asked the final question. Mr. Cross, do you believe the home plan is working? Thomas nodded. Do you want it to continue? Nod. Do you understand that if your needs increase, another setting may eventually become safer? Thomas looked at Julian, then nodded. Julian's eyes filled. Thomas reached for the marker. He wrote slowly, Ask me. Julian looked at the words. I will. Thomas tapped the page. Julian nodded again. I promise. Thomas leaned back. The meeting ended. Later, Leah found father and son in the kitchen. Julian held the coffee pot. Do you want coffee? Thomas opened his mouth. Nothing came. Julian waited. Thomas tried again. Still nothing. Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Thomas looked at him. A smile appeared. Julian smiled back. What? Thomas pointed toward the table. The orange card sat between them. Wait. Julian laughed. I know. He put the coffee pot down. Thomas tried again. Tay. Julian stared. You made me stand here for 40 seconds to tell me you don't want coffee? Thomas nodded. Julian shook his head. Unbelievable. Thomas smiled. Julian reached for the kettle. Then Thomas touched his wrist. Julian looked back. Thomas struggled for another word. Julian waited. Stay. Julian's expression changed. I'm not going anywhere. Thomas shook his head. Not quite. Julian understood. Stay did not mean remain in the building. It meant be here. For years, Julian Cross had measured his life by what moved when he entered a room. Employees stood. Meetings started. Numbers changed. Decisions happened. Problems were solved. His father's stroke had given him a problem that could not be solved quickly enough to satisfy him. So Julian had tried to move faster. More appointments. More equipment. More rules, a safer building. A better system. And one frightened caregiver had finally forced him to understand that sometimes love did not look like moving faster. Sometimes, love was a chair across from someone who needed longer. Sometimes dignity was not independence. Sometimes protection was not control. And sometimes, the most important answer in the room was the one everyone had to wait for. Julian sat down. Thomas looked satisfied. Outside, the garden needed pruning again. The overnight caregiver would arrive at 8 p.m. Leah would return the next morning. Brookhaven remained an option, not an enemy. The suitcase remained in the closet. Nothing was guaranteed. Nothing needed to be. Julian's phone buzzed again. He reached into his pocket. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Julian took out the phone, then turned it face down on the table. Thomas nodded. Julian pointed to the orange card. "I know, Dad." Thomas waited. Julian smiled. "I can wait." Thomas took his time. And this time, his son stayed.